Good morning, everyone. I'm Communications Director Brianna Aho. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. One final reminder for people on the phone, please do keep your lines muted until the Attorney General calls for questions at the end of the press conference. With that, Attorney General Bob Ferguson.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Thank you all for being here on this appropriately beautiful day that we have here in the Northwest. So really, first, just thanks to everybody who's here, all of our guests, many of whom will be introduced shortly. It's really an honor to have so many folks take time from their busy lives and on such a beautiful day to be here today in this wonderful facility for this announcement that we are all very excited to make. Before we get started on the speaking program, Chairman Wooten of the Samish Indian Nation really graciously offered to begin this event with a prayer song. And we were chatting beforehand, and the chairman mentioned he's done a prayer song right here before in this facility in the past. And so it's, to put it very mildly, it's an honor, number one, to have him here today, and number two, especially to have the chairman begin this event with the prayer song. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chairman Wooten, thank you so much for that really beautiful opening prayer song. We so appreciate it. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the person I think it's fair to say is most responsible for our gathering here today. There have been many folks who have worked really hard to make this day possible, but I think it's fair to say that President Fawn Sharp of the Quinault Indian Nation is perhaps most responsible for bringing this together. And President Sharp is going to do some introductions for us before we get started with the speaking program. And so I just want to say personally, President Sharp, it's just been, just been a wonderful person to work with. Reaching out, being really committed to this effort, sticking with it, bringing all of her experience, and bringing a lot of folks together, which is what something like this really requires. So, President Sharp, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we get into the program, we do want to make some introductions of those who are here. Along with myself from Quinault, we have our Vice President, Tyson Johnston. Samish, Tom Wooten. Snoqualmie, the Chair, Bob De Los Angeles. Vice Chair Michael Ross. Councilwoman Colleen Williams. And Puyallup, we have our esteemed former chairwoman Ramona Bennett is in the house. It's always awkward to do an introduction of someone who seems to not need an introduction. But Ramona is here, and we're so honored that she was able to join us today, along with Puyallup Councilman James Rideout. We also want to recognize AT&I. AT&I Executive Director Terry Parr, along with his staff, are here as well. AT&I represents 57 tribal nations throughout the Northwest. So that's our esteemed leadership who are present here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Sharp, and thanks again to all of you for being here. It's great to see different generations of folks here in this wonderful space. So we're here today, and I'll give some opening remarks, by the way. President Sharp will have some remarks as well, and I think we're going to open up to other tribal leaders who may wish to add some words as well. And then of course, we'll be happy to take any questions that individuals may have. So we're here today to announce a new policy for the Office of the Attorney General that we believe is certainly the first of its kind here in Washington State, and we think very possibly is the first of its kind for any Office of the Attorney General anywhere in the United States. So effective immediately, my office is adopting a consultation and consent policy regarding Washington's 29 federally recognized tribes. Going forward, my office will obtain free, prior, and informed consent before initiating a program or project that directly affects tribes in our state. With this announcement, as I mentioned, we believe we're the first entity in Washington State to adopt such a policy. To give some sense of what this looks like, prior to starting litigation, for example, on behalf of the state, the AG's office, as you all know, works on behalf of many state clients. Before the state would initiate any litigation in regards to a tribe, we will engage in meaningful consultation with the affected tribes. I also we've had many folks who have been introduced. There are a number of folks on my team who are here today. I won't introduce them all, but Yasmin Trudeau, my Legislative Affairs Director, and Deputy Attorney General Kristen Mitchell, along with my Chief of Staff, Mike Webb, have all been very involved in helping to put this together. As well as you might imagine, virtually every aspect of my office, which is a large office, more than 1,000 employees, many divisions. There's been a lot of work to make sure that that all those divisions, many of which their work intersects with tribes and tribal governments, have worked on this policy. So I want to thank them all for their hard work on this. Tribal governments are sovereign nations, and it's important to keep that in mind. That's intuitive to everybody who's here, but I know when I go around and speak to the state, to people around the state, it's not always intuitive. And so it's important to start with that tribal governments are sovereign nations. They are our partners in many significant respects, including co-managing many of Washington's important natural resources. The policy that I'm announcing today, we believe, will further strengthen these partnerships, improve our relationships, and help better resolve disputes when they arise. So there's three aspects to the policy: consent, consultation, notice. I'll briefly talk about each of them. So when my office is looking at a policy or a program that will directly and tangibly affect tribes, tribal rights, tribal lands, or sacred sites, we won't move forward until we obtain that free, prior, and informed consent I mentioned earlier. That means a written resolution from the highest elected body, from every federally recognized tribe that may be directly impacted. I'm adopting this policy today, and I'll propose legislation in the 2020 legislative session to memorialize and preserve this policy in statute. The goal here, of course, is to have this policy in place not just for any one particular Attorney General, but put in statute so it remains in place for future Attorneys General as well. Now, there are some functions of my office, many in fact, where obtaining consent from an outside party would not be possible, or in some circumstances, not even allowable in our role as the attorney for the state of Washington. So, for example, actions related to litigation, legal advice to our clients, or other circumstances where we could be subject to sanction from a court if we fail to act. So our new policy requires that, consistent with the rules of professional conduct, which guide all lawyers in the state of Washington, my office will consult with tribes before filing any civil litigation against a sovereign tribal government or tribal-owned business. Wherever possible, I'm personally committed to participating in this consultation myself with any tribe that accepts our invitation. If not, my chief deputy, for example, would be participating. One of the goals here is to, just having had a lot of experience now in my, I guess, six years as Attorney General, it's important that my attorneys do their work right on behalf of the state. I think it's also fair to say it's important for the leadership of the office to make sure that we are in the room early in the process with tribes. And I think sometimes that can facilitate reaching a resolution. Attorneys need to do their jobs on both sides, on behalf of tribes, of course, and on behalf of the state. But I think it's fair to say, now having a fair amount of experience on litigation of all sorts, but with tribes in particular, I think that getting the leadership of my office involved in those conversations as early as possible, literally at the beginning, I have little doubt will make a big difference in resolving the disagreements that will sometimes arise between the state and tribes. The third piece of our policy requires us to provide meaningful notice to all affected tribes. So I'll try and give a couple of specific examples, and there can be many. We've spent a lot of time thinking about in our office the many ways our work intersects with tribes. One thing I'll just will emphasize here before going through this is that I view this document as something that can hopefully be improved as time goes on. It's impossible, I think, to anticipate every possible scenario. We've tried to set rough ground rules for how this might work for our office, but we'll be open to additional consultation on the specific policy moving forward. But to give some examples, so my office frequently files what are called amicus briefs in courts here in Washington State and across the country. An amicus brief is called a friend of the court brief. It's a fancy word for friend of the court. As Attorney General, I can file an amicus brief in any court anywhere in the country on any issue that I think is important for the state of Washington. That's an authority that we take very seriously. I literally have a meeting every single week with my team to talk about potential amicus briefs. Many of those can impact tribes. The Indian Child Welfare Act is a huge issue for tribes across our state that the state of Washington has been very involved in, working with amicus briefs with other states to defend that act and the constitutionality of that act. So these amicus briefs, when I file them on behalf of the state and the people of the state, and they can have huge impacts on tribes or other individuals in our state. So prior to proposing filing an amicus brief, for example, if it directly impacts tribes, we would, of course, provide meaningful notice to all affected tribes. The same would go for any proposed legislation that I, as Attorney General, can propose. As Attorney General, I frequently propose AG request legislation that can have huge ramifications for the people of the state and the tribes of the state. So if one of those pieces of legislation impacts tribes, we would notify tribes in advance. Another example, after issuing a ballot statement on initiatives, that's work my office does, putting together ballot statements on initiatives. If we see that proposed initiative may directly affect tribes and tribal lands, we will notify tribes. This policy is effective immediately, and in fact, it's appropriate we're starting today because I will begin implementing this policy today. So for example, this afternoon, my office will send out notice to all 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington State, informing them of a ballot initiative that's been filed by Tim Eyman that will directly affect tribes and tribal schools. The proposed initiative 1014 would remove the provision allowing tribal schools to adopt a policy preferring Native American teachers. That's embedded in that initiative. So with this policy, because my legal team, of course, works intimately with these proposed initiatives in a way that most Washingtonians have no idea is going on, it'll be our responsibility to notify tribes of an issue like that, and we'll be doing that later on today. Moreover, I'm committed to pursuing Attorney General request legislation next session, as I mentioned, to memorialize this in statute with the state legislature, and look forward to having their support in that effort. So we believe this is a historic step for the Office of the Attorney General, but really at its heart, it's a simple one, and that is to respect the sovereign status of tribes here in Washington State. We believe this will improve relationships. We believe those relationships are good now, but like any relationship, a relationship can always be improved. And I guess as I wrap up my comments for right now is, this document does not come out of a vacuum, right? This has been the result of many conversations with many people who are here today, some who could not make it today. I think it's important for any leader to listen to those that they interact with, to learn from past experiences, to not simply repeat the same formula of how we do business. I think that's really important, and sometimes that's not always the easiest path to say, hey, you know what, we really could improve here. But you know, we've spent a lot of time in the office thinking about how our work intersects with tribes, the magnitude of that work on tribes and tribal members, and just it seemed important to find a new path forward that can improve an already good relationship with my office and the state with tribes. And really, we hope this is a model. I plan to send a copy of this policy to every attorney general in the country. I'm confident other AGs will see this and be interested in this. I talk with other AGs all the time, particularly Western AGs, about work we do with tribes. They're interested in that work, and it's my hope that this policy won't just be good for Washington State, but can perhaps provide a blueprint for other AGs and other states across the country as well. So with that, I'm going to turn this back to President Fawn Sharp, who I had the pleasure of introducing earlier, and again, who's been just a key leader in many respects in our state, but on this issue in particular. President Sharp. Thanks. Yeah, it's out of your way.
Thank you, Attorney General Bob Ferguson. You know, today is a day that it seems surreal. I mentioned to Bob earlier that we've worked long and hard, and not just we, this generation, but generations of Native peoples that occupy this area have been under a steady and constant, seemingly oppositional relationship for the last 400 years. If you trace our history, we've had conflicts and controversies with the United States on the battlefields where much bloodshed was lost, on the rivers, trying to exercise our treaty fishing rights, at home, trying to defend our lands against the impacts of climate change. And every aspect of our relationship where it's grown has been out of a state of conflict and controversy, whether on the battlefield, on the rivers, in the halls of Congress, in the courtrooms. But today, we're hoping to close that dark chapter of state-tribal relations and open a new chapter that is based on a recognition of truly government-to-government relationships, where that definition has some meaning, where tribal nations, when we sit at the table, we sit as equal sovereigns. There's a recognition that we do have a government-to-government relationship, but what we often find is when we are consulted, our voice is silent. Because no matter how loudly we scream or raise objections, our voice falls on deaf ears. And you could go across Indian country throughout this state and find case after case where we entered and exercised consultation. And it appeared as though it was an administrative exercise where there was a predetermined course of action that unilaterally affected our land territories and resources. And we know that people support and respect us, but actions are so much more important than words. And the actions of today is finally and historically recognizing that we are equal sovereigns and that our voice is no longer silent when we raise issues on things that directly affect our land territories, resources, people, and sacred sites. Our voice is not only heard, it matters and it's decisive. That's a big difference in being able to just state your case, have it fall on deaf ears, and have a voice that is meaningful, that springs from a relationship of a political equality and where it's decisive. Our former president at Quinault, Joe Delacruz, said that that's the greatest expression of tribal sovereignty, is to be able to make decisions affecting your people without external interference. And that has long been our one and only prayer. We're characterized as a lot of things, but the one thing that we've always asked is to live as our Creator intended on the lands gifted to our ancestors when time began. We just want to live as Native people. But in living that life, we've had to go to war, we've had to shed blood, we've had to be beaten on the rivers, we've had to go through so much long and protracted litigation over the years that's expensive. And we know at the heart of those relationships there's common ground. And we found in Attorney General Bob Ferguson some common ground and bold leadership, courageous leadership, where we could finally have a conversation to sit down and write a policy that is enforceable, where our voice is decisive, and where we have the ability to have a direct say in our land, territories, and resources and sacred sites. Those issues affecting our people. And we are here today not just out of the work of this generation. For generations, tribal leaders have struggled for how do we achieve this place where once we signed those treaties centuries ago, it seemed like the very next day they were broken, and for centuries later. How do we solve this problem? The world came together in 2007 at the United Nations and signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to put into words a universal principle and standard that Indigenous peoples have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. 4 countries opposed that right. The United States was among those. In 2010, President Obama embraced that policy, and now the world recognizes it. But nowhere can you find, except today here in Washington State, where that's not only recognized, it's decisive, and it's an enforceable right. And so we are here today to not only honor all those who've come before us, who made so many sacrifices in so many places throughout the world for Indigenous peoples to have that decisive voice when it comes to their land, territories, and sacred sites. In this very moment, there are Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world who risk their life to even talk about their basic human and civil rights as Indigenous peoples. There are millions, 100 million Indigenous peoples throughout the world, and we are here today to lead that way to ensure that Indigenous peoples throughout the world have those same protections. It is a universal principle that transcends national borders and should be honored by every government and every nation within this entire planet. And it starts here today. We are closing that dark chapter of long controversies and conflict where we have seemingly no voice, where we have a meaningful voice and a decisive voice. And we are also here to honor those past leaders that have gone before us and those future generations of Native people yet to be born, because the work that we do is going to bring about so many other things to those future generations when they fight issues like climate change. They're not going to have to camp for months, for years in sub-zero temperatures just to try to keep external forces from destroying their sacred sites. In this present day and age, that should be unacceptable. It should be a basic principle. And I'm happy to hear the Attorney General talk about this as a simple, basic principle, because that's how we see it. And for the first time ever in this country are we standing in a moment and in a time where we finally have a meeting of minds on the most basic and fundamental principle that we have fought for centuries just to achieve. This is a bright day. This is a shining example for the entire world to see. And it's our intent to join the Attorney General to ensure that this principle is not only adopted next year in the state legislature, but we lead the nationalization of this principle. And once that's accomplished, we intend to lead internationally to ensure that all those who want to speak out on their own precious, God-given human and civil rights no longer have to risk death just to speak those words. So on behalf of the Quinault Nation, all of our partners, we are so humble and honored and blessed to be here to share this moment. Siokwiel.
Thank you, President Sharp. And I'd like to, if others would like to say a few words, we certainly have time and just want to open it up to anyone who might want to add a few words. So I'm just going to step aside, and I think I'm Chairman Woon is making eye contact, so we'll start here, but open up to others as well. Go right ahead, Chairman.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, again, I'm honored to be here today. It was a special blessing for me to be able to share a song with you all and open up this ceremony. This is a beautiful house that we're in, and it's fitting that we're in this house. This is a monumental day for not just Indian country, but the state of Washington as well. And in this day and age, all the things that are going on with climate change, acidification of the Salish Sea, all this stuff's real, and we all have to work together. And I think this is a step in the right direction to bring everyone to the table with their voice being heard, to be able to steer us in the right direction, because it's going to take this generation and the next one and the next one after that to really make a difference. And this is the start that I'd hoped was going to happen. And with the help of everyone here today and the Attorney General and his staff, it's a reality. So my hands go up to each and every one of you that are here today, and those that couldn't make it, I'm glad that you made the effort. The generational, look to my elder. I'm happy that you're here today. Warms my heart to see you again.
I'm one of the ones that went before, but I didn't go.
So with that, I thank you all, and I will turn the mic over to the next speaker.
As chairman of the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe, on behalf of the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe, I'd like to thank Attorney General Bob Ferguson for his leadership role in the tribal government-to-government consent. Thank you, Bob.
Wiats, si Tagualapu, Gualapu Tiishid, Tagualapu, Gualapu Tiishid, Stokwalbuchad. Thank you all, honorable ones, my family, my relations. I'm of the Snoqualmie people. My name is Michael Ross. I'm the vice chair of the Snoqualmie Indian Nation. I'm very happy to be here in front of all of you. Today, Attorney General Bob Ferguson has announced bold new policy that will recognize and respect tribal sovereignty in Washington state. It is a great way to communicate and collaborate with tribes in better efforts to respect their rights across the state. We are very proud to have worked with him and his staff to come up with these bold new policies that hopefully become law across the nation. Thank you.
He got my back. Are these tilted right? You think? Yeah, that's a little bit better. My name is Lakshot. I'm known as Ramona Bennett, and I'm the former chairwoman of the Puyallup tribe back in the more crazy days of the 60s and 70s. Now, what I've been taught and told is that we were put on that river to protect our brothers and sisters, the nations of salmon. And it's been a battle. We were the tribe that triggered the Bolt decision. When I say triggered, literally, we really had to fight for that right to harvest. So we were recognized and had the right to protect the brothers and sisters. And there was a lot going on and a lot of cleanup and a lot of work to try to protect those salmons. And now we have an LNG plant that'll hold 6 million gallons of liquefied gas, built right on the Asarco arsenic fill that's out there at the mouth of our river in the port of Tacoma. And our salmons are still in jeopardy. And we're looking at 200 tons of airborne toxic emissions that are going to come from that refinery storage. And so we've been fighting this. It's been years now. And you know, the salmons are like the canaries in the tunnels. You know, they're the indicator of life, of how we're going to be able to survive. You know, our tribe has 400 new babies. Our tribe has gotten so cute. We've got all these beautiful new little babies, and they hope to grow up and have lives and be able to eat food and sing songs and have friends and get educations and have futures. But our planet is not going to be livable. It's not going to be livable. If we fail to protect the salmon, we're done, because we're just here to protect them. And if we fail that, we're done. But tragically, so is everyone. This is a worldwide problem. And, you know, I love Bob. You know, all I have to compare him to is Slade, but I do love Bob. And I know he's sincere, but I also know there was a treaty, there was an enabling act, there was a centennial, there was an accord. You know, they made us many promises. They only kept but one. They promised to take the land, and they took the land. That's an old Sioux saying, if there's any Sioux here. But he is sincere. He is being truthful, and our green governor probably has his back, and hopefully the legislators will see that it's essential, it's necessary, it's going to be fatal if this doesn't happen, because us Indians really are the monitors and the guardians and the protectors of our share of the planet. And if we can get a little flow started here, maybe it'll spread. We've seen that these whales are dying with their bellies full of plastic. They can't eat, they can't digest, because they're so full of the waste that's in the ocean. You know, it's got to stop, and I'm depending on Mr. Ferguson to help with our seal and sea lion problem. I mean, our salmons are in jeopardy from flawed laws, flawed environmental considerations, and this is a good day. You know, this is a first, because I think they might be the first ones to actually keep their word. Thank you. Aren't you going to say anything? Yeah. At least introduce yourself.
Yeah. As a tribal leader, these are our mentors. We have that obligation to fulfill the expectation for our future generations. And it's nice to know that we have a preventative measure instead of reacting to what's happening to us. So many times we have to go in and someone else represents us in these individual cases across our Indian lands. And so I'm grateful today that freedom, prior, and consent is, being established so we can use our resources for other things. And we can, continue to work green environments and turn our tribes into green and all those types of things that are so important for our future generations. And so I'm extremely grateful for Bob and Fawn Sharp and all the different varieties of groups. I'm sure there's a handful that went into this work. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the Puyallup tribe, and thank you very much.
Thank you all again, Ramona. Thank you for being here. And I think we're at the part of the program. If folks have any questions, I think, and President Sharp and others, feel free to assist in answering questions. But if there are any questions, we're happy to take them now or afterwards. We'll be around a little bit if there's questions afterwards as well. Any questions? Oh, and there are, sorry, so I'll take one here. I think Brianna's reminding me there might be some folks on the phone, so I'll do a quick check after I take this question to see if anyone's there has a question. Yes, go right ahead. How did the question get started and when did that happen? So President Sharp will help me. I guess, and we may have a slightly different recollection. I'll speak for myself first, and she may have a different starting point in some respects. I'll emphasize it's been ongoing for some time. I'll just start with that. So it wouldn't be like I could pinpoint but I think, I've worked with President Sharp now, for a long time, of course, and have always really valued her input on issues related to issues facing the state and tribes in particular. So we've just had an ongoing conversation now over many years. I think it's fair to say, speaking kind of from my perspective, that, candidly, the culverts litigation was a real challenge in many respects, and hopefully we don't have to spend too much time going through the details of that here today. But it was, look, I realized that how we were doing things, we being the Office Attorney General, it wasn't working, right? And just say we've always done it that way is not a reason to continue doing it that way, right? That wasn't good enough. And I think what was helpful was President Sharp and other tribal leaders as well, but especially President Sharp, I think really was reaching out at that time to say, hey, Bob, let's talk. And I was reaching out to a lot of tribal leaders at that time, but President Sharp had an idea, I think it's fair to say, that really resonated with me on how to, not just how to litigate something differently next time, right? We've tried that before, but how to actually change the whole framework by which we have a dialogue and a conversation, something more fundamental in some respects. And so I think I can say for me, just speaking personally, while there's been ongoing conversations with many folks across the state, I think it's fair to say that was, I think, a key moment from my perspective, and that President Sharp and others came forward with this concept. Now then it took a lot of conversations on her side, the tribe side, my team, as you can imagine, it's a big office to try and figure out what does this look like? How do we put this together? It's, as you've heard, first of its kind, so there were many challenges in how we put it together. But I would say that was, from my standpoint, that was a key moment, I would say. Well, that's the starting point, I don't know if it's quite right, but I'll let President Sharp speak to it as well.
Yes, the Quinault Nation really tracked the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We tracked it in 2007 when there was a global vote, and we happened to introduce President Obama at the White House Tribal Nations Summit when he ultimately announced to the world that the United States would embrace it. And throughout those years, from 2010 forward, we would raise this issue in discussions with the state of Washington. And I would agree, the Culverts case seemed to be that point where we thought we need to draw a line in the sand and try to close that chapter of conflict and oppositional relationships where we could rise above treaty conflicts, where we could rise above the protracted and expensive litigation. And in meeting with Governor Inslee, we challenged him during the Culverts case. And at this year's Centennial Accord, we challenged him to say, we do not want to ever be put in a position again where we have to litigate and defend our treaty without going through a process. And so it was very clear at that point that we were reaching out and we were hoping that there would be some level of response from the state actors. And that level of response came from Attorney General Ferguson to say, let's sit down and talk. And from there, policy discussions evolved, legal discussions obviously evolved, but ultimately it's been a good 10, 12 years that we've advocated for FPIC, not only here in the state of Washington. 2 years ago, the Quinault Nation was invited to Santiago, Chile, as an expert witness for North America when the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples heard global testimony from throughout the world on the theme of free, prior, and informed consent. So the Quinault Nation has standing and international recognition on FPIC, and I remember opening our remarks at that event and realizing every contour of our relationship with every sovereign is born out of conflict and controversy. Why is it so difficult to just sit down at a table where we share political equality? And that's really what motivated us 2 years ago to then really push this issue here at home in the state of Washington following our international engagement, because we tried at all levels. We tried at the state, we tried engaging with the US State Department, we tried at the United Nations, and it just seems very logical that if we can start here, we now have those channels open, and it's our intent to utilize this as a model. So it's been a decade-long effort on our part, and prior to our generation, going back to the 60s and 70s, and even before then, there's been a solid effort to try to gain political equality.
And, oh, yes, go right ahead, yeah.
How might, if this policy had been in place
Yeah.
throughout the Culver case, how might it should change the direction of that case or potentially, I guess not the outcome, but
Right.
sort of outcomes one thing?
So the Culver's case in some respects is a little different because that was litigation that was ongoing before I became Attorney General. But I can speak going sort of way back when that litigation was initiated by the tribes a number of years ago now. I think what you would have seen is, and I wasn't there, I wasn't Attorney General at the time, but having those early conversations around that litigation and all what led up to the litigation by the tribes against the state, clearly there was a lot of dissatisfaction at the time. What I can say, looking back on my experience, there was, in becoming Attorney General, we inherited the case, obviously, it was already well on its way through the courts. I've spent a lot of time looking back on that case, I think it's fair to say, and thinking about the different steps. My job's tricky in a lot of senses, but one is that I do represent the state. They're my client, I represent the state, and I have a certain role there. On the other hand, we have partnership with sovereign nations across the state as well. So I think looking back on it, I think if this policy had been in place when I became Attorney General, I think that would have prompted me earlier in the process of Culver's, once I became Attorney General, to frankly reach out to tribes at that moment. Yes, it's a case I've inherited. Yes, we're at a certain process legally, but hey, let's start right now. I'm the new Attorney General. Where are we at? Is there a pathway forward here at this point besides litigating this all the way up to the United States Supreme Court? And so, and I think that approach would have been helpful. No guarantees it's going to change an outcome. I think everybody here is aware that sometimes there are disagreements. That's true in any relationship. Human, between sovereign nations, sometimes there are disagreements. But I think when I look back on it, I think it's fair to say from my standpoint, those conversations eventually happened. I was in the room with some folks who are here with me today, but having those earlier in the process, I think would have been helpful. I'm going to see if there's anyone on the phone who has a question. So I'm just going to open up for those on the phone. If anyone's there who has a question, go right ahead. And if not, oh, yes, another question. Then President Sharp, before we wrap up, I'm going to see if you have a final thought before we wrap up. Yes, go right ahead.
You briefly mentioned tsunami.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a little bit? It sounds like that'll be your first piece of action. Is that correct?
Correct.
What is he doing that? Can you just elaborate that?
Yeah, an initiative and Yasmin Trudeau is here, by the way, in my team, and I don't know if you want to speak to it necessarily, but I think the initiative number, which I gave in my remarks, embedded in that initiative is language that has an impact on tribes. Yasmin, I'm not sure if you want to add to that or not.
So as most of you here are familiar with, there's initiative I-1000 that recently passed through the legislature, and prior to that passage, Tim Eyman filed an additional initiative that used pre-2013 language it was based on the original I-200 language, which did not exempt tribal compact schools. So this is an opportunity to provide notice to tribes that initiative has been filed and to make them aware that that exemption was not present in his filing. So there have been subsequent petitions that initiatives, that he has filed that include the post-2013 language, but that one did not.
So that's an example of an opportunity where we have information we're working on something where we can notify tribes on something that I suspect would be of interest to tribes, and that they have that appropriate notice is really just that in the past, that is not necessarily something that we would have done, that my team would not have been aware of. Hey, wait a second, here's a tribal issue embedded in this initiative language. We have an obligation to reach out to tribes across the state to make sure they know about that because they may have some thoughts about it. So, and so that is an example of, and I think one thing I will emphasize as we start to wrap up is that, I'll reemphasize is that there's been a lot of time spent on this, but I do view this as a policy that will need to adapt and change. It just will. We're a huge law firm. We have more than 600 attorneys, more than 500 professional staff. We have 13 offices all around the state. We represent a couple hundred state clients. I mean, you can imagine there's a lot of issues out there, and we've done the best we can to reach out to all the folks in our office. And I will add that I think it's a credit to my team that they have approached this with an open mind. So it's not, and this is something I strive for as a leader of the organization, is you always want to protect what works well in an organization like the AG's office, which is a fantastic office, but also you've got to be willing to change when you need to change. And having people in leadership in the office who are open to that, to say, hey, yeah, maybe we do need to make some changes, and to be open to that, because it's taken a lot of work to make sure we've done that, which I greatly appreciate. Just before I turn over to President Sharp for a final word, I just want to say I've had many press conferences as Attorney General, which is always a pleasure, but I think it's fair to say this is one that I'll never forget. I so appreciate everybody who's taken the time to be here today, some on relatively short notice, and to all of you for being here as well. I think it's appropriate if President Sharp has the final word. President Sharp.
Well, I'm still standing here thinking, is this really happening? Or I'm waiting to sort of wake up from a reality. You know, the political landscape across this country is seemingly, well, it is unpredictable. We never know day to day what we're going to be facing. And for tribal nations, it's been quite a journey. Throughout the years, throughout the centuries, and even for our generation, we have witnessed so much in the last decade. And to have an opportunity to close a chapter where we didn't have an era of political equality, and to open a new chapter of reconciliation, to rise above treaty conflicts and those sort of conflicts that just cut to our core, I think is a new point. It's exciting. I can't believe it's happening. The concept of FPIC was introduced into a piece of legislation during last year's legislative session. And at that moment, I thought I would never live to see the day when I was a student overseas studying international human rights. This seemed so far out there, so aspirational. I truly wondered if I would ever live to see the day where FPIC would become something that would not only be recognized, but an enforceable right. And here we are today. I am so honored. I'm so humbled. I just can't believe it. And to all the tribal leaders that are here with us, all the tribal leaders across the family of AT&I who came together with us last year to adopt this policy regionally, my hands are up to everyone. And to all those, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, across the world, we want to serve as that beacon of light and that inspiration of hope, that it can be achievable. This is not beyond our goals. I mean, we can certainly achieve it, and it does take bold leadership on both sides. And today we're witness to that. So it's truly an honored day. I'm so grateful. I'm so humble. And it's sunny. And it's Friday. And it's Native American Day. It's all those things here in the state of Washington. In this moment, it's all happening. So I'm so grateful. My hands are up to all of you. Siokliel.